thank you for coming out on this dark and stormy night, as they say. My name is Andy Thayer. I'm with the Gay Liberation Network, and we're very pleased to be hosted today by Broadway United Methodist Church. Thank you very much for folks from the church. And also, of course, Kevin Ovenden, who came all the way from Greece to do a series of speaking engagements here. I'd like to just start out, for those who may not have caught the news today. 55 Palestinians were killed today, apparently mainly by Israeli sharpshooters, including children. And this was only unusual in the number of people who were killed and injured today. There were several hundred injured today, I understand. Over the past few weeks, there have been up to 8,000 injured and several dozen others killed by Israeli sharpshooters. And one might say, well, why is this going on? For those who know anything about Gaza, and Kevin's going to go into that a lot more, some 1.3 million of the 1.9 million people living in Gaza are themselves refugees or descendants of refugees from the 1948 borders of Israel. They were pushed out as part of the Israeli War of Independence. And one might ask, why is an LGBT organization doing an event in solidarity with Palestinians? And there's a few different reasons. For one thing, for the last several years, the Israeli state, allied with organizations such as A Wider Bridge, have worked mightily to try and leverage Israel's alleged greater tolerance for LGBTs so as to win support for Israel to basically divert attention from the horrible, horrible civil rights violations against Palestinians. That by itself should be a reason why LGBT organizations should be taking up this issue. But beyond that, you have a situation where we here in the United States, for the past few decades especially, have fought mightily, as we were fighting for LGBTQ rights, in order to prevent the religious right from getting this country declared a quote-unquote Christian nation. A nation where Christians were first-class citizens and everyone else whom they decided was not part of their Christianity were second-class citizens. And we have fortunately staved off a lot of those assaults heretofore, but we would not be having the rights that we do enjoy today if the religious right had been successful in that. Well, from its birth, Israel has declared itself a Jewish nation. And people who are atheists, people who are Christian, people who are Muslim, have been, by definition, second-class citizen. And Kevin's going to be talking in far greater detail what that would mean. But basically, this whole notion of having a theocracy in any area of the world, especially Israel being the #1 recipient by far of U.S. arms aid, is something that should be repugnant to all those who favor LGBT freedom. Thirdly, our president, Donald Trump, has made a crusade of allying with the most bigoted elements in the United States society. We're talking about the Christian right, which has been notoriously anti-Semitic for decades, which has been racist against African Americans, against immigrants, and others. And it is no accident, I would argue, that Donald Trump now is in this full embrace of the Israeli state, indeed the most right-wing elements within the Israeli state. And it's because, frankly, Israel is a racist state. And Donald Trump has got no problem endorsing and embracing that authoritarianism, that racism against a huge portion of that population. Finally, I would say that we as LGBTs, we have gotten a lot of aid in our justice struggles over the past few decades. We would not arguably have gotten where we are today, not to say that there aren't a lot more things that we need to win. We would not be where we are today without the support of other oppressed minorities fighting for their freedom. And we, as LGBTs, are not deserving of rights unless we are embracing the justice struggles for all oppressed peoples. And arguably, in the world today, Palestinians are amongst the most repressed. They are certainly in the crosshairs of the United States government as it uses Israel as a linchpin to control a huge and very valuable area of the world. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Kevin Ovenden.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy.
And Kevin will be not only talking about why LGBTs and everyone should support Palestinian rights, but presumably giving us a lot of information about the situation in Israel-Palestine today. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Andy. And thanks for a great introduction. I'm aiming to speak for about 35 to perhaps 40 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for discussion, and we can have a more discursive meeting with lots of questions and debate around them. As Andy said, the news from Palestine today is absolutely dreadful. The particular part of Palestine on the border between Gaza and Israel itself. Over 55 people killed, over 1,200 wounded. This comes on top of already 50 people killed in what have been called the... can people hear okay? Can you hear okay at the back? Of what have been called the Great Return Marches. Marches for the right of those 1.3 million refugees in Gaza and many, many more elsewhere in the world to return to the homes that they were driven out of or that their grandparents were driven out of. And there was the most obscene contrast between the Israeli armed forces gunning down Palestinian civilians, including women and children on the one hand, and on the other, the world's rich and some, not all of the governments, gathering in Jerusalem in Al-Quds to open the new American embassy as Trump fulfilled his threat or promise, whichever way you look at it, to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The whole embassy isn't moving, actually, but it is more than a symbolic move, because what that move does is it tears up 70 years of settled international consensus, which is first that Jerusalem, at the point at which Israel and Palestine were partitioned in 1947, 1948, was declared to be a separate entity from both Palestine and Israel. Part of it was to be the capital of Palestine, but Jerusalem was held to be a world historic site which was under international protection. That's completely gone. The second thing that's gone with Trump's move is that the peace process, the Oslo peace process, which began in 1993, people hear the term two states. Yeah, goes back to 1993. A critical part of that process was that the status of Jerusalem would be settled at the end of negotiations. Now we can come on to discuss whether it was ever viable or feasible for there to be two states, given Israeli expansionism. We can come on to discuss that. But what this decision does is tear up what has been American doctrine on the Middle East, on Israel-Palestine, for the last 25 years or more. And another contrast, or perhaps link into this meeting, is that on Sunday night, Israel won the Eurovision Song Contest. Now, I don't know if people watch it here at all. I mean, I don't actually watch it in Europe. But the Eurovision Song Contest is kind of gaudy. It's a very camp competition. And I don't know if it's actually true that many lesbians and gay men watch it, but it's held to be true that lots of people watch it because it's so camp and flamboyant and so on. We're all supposed to be so camp and flamboyant. And you might ask yourself, how is it possible for Israel, a country which is in the Near East, on the continent of Asia, even to participate in the Eurovision Song Contest, let alone win the Eurovision Song Contest? And therein lies a key part of what I want to say in the meeting, which is the nature of Israel as a colonial settler state, an extension of Europe into the Middle East, and forged in ways that I want to go on to explain in a few moments. But the Eurovision Song Contest participation fits with an overall policy of trying to normalize the state of Israel, to normalize its land grabs, already in 1948, and increasingly to normalize the de facto annexation of large parts of the 22% of historic Palestine, which is what was left to the Palestinians after the 1948 war. If people look, I don't know if people have seen the maps here, you look at the West Bank, which is the most populous area of Palestinians. It's like a kidney shape. And it's been eaten out by these settlements. I mean, these settlements are not just, they're not like a couple of log cabins out in Montana. Right? They're new towns and cities, fortified, water diverted to them, roads blocked off. And if anybody challenges you about the relevance of the concept of apartheid to what exists in the West Bank, certainly, you just have to look at the images, just Google them. Images of a road which is for Jewish citizens and a road which is for Palestinians. The road which is for Jewish citizens is like a freeway. The road for Palestinians is little more than a dirt track. The attempt to normalize the state of Israel is part of what this meeting is about. But we have to go back, I think, to look at the creation of the state of Israel in the first place. The Zionist movement, and the Zionist movement, well, the way I'm using the term is the political Zionist movement, a movement to create a Jewish nation state, a physical state entity somewhere in the world. The Zionist political movement arose at the end of the 19th century as a response, a rather distorted response, and a minority response to the growth of anti-Semitism in Europe and by extension into North America. It was very, very shocking for people because there had, of course, been anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, fueled by obscurantist religious ideas of either the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church a bit later. But the birth of liberal democracies, the birth of parliamentarism, the French Revolution of 1789, the gradual extension of the vote in Britain, led people to believe that that kind of monstrous ideology would be buried away in the dark Middle Ages. In fact, it came surging back in a new form, in a form of racism, not a form of religious discrimination. So it didn't make any difference whether you converted from being Jewish to being Christian. The mark of being Jewish was taken to be a racial characteristic. The end result of which, or one end result of which, the most devastating, was, of course, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and the Holocaust. So it was a response, but the response was this. The Zionist leaders said, we have this resurgent anti-Semitism. This shows that even if there's progress in the world, Jews will never be safe among non-Jews. The only way we can be safe is to separate ourselves off and form our own nation state. And they took up the ideas of nationalism in general at the end of the 19th century. Everybody was trying to form their own nation state. Those people who hadn't, those people unlike Britain or France or the United States who hadn't forged one already. It was a distorted response, which in a sense took anti-Semitism for granted as the eternal hatred, a very pessimistic response. It was also a minority response because the bulk of the Jewish people in Europe looked in one way or another to the socialist left. And secondly, to liberal parliamentarism, if you look at the more middle-class people. So, for example, as late as 1938 in Poland, which is where 3.3 million Jewish people lived, the Jewish Socialist Workers' Bund collective won 70% of the vote. And their slogan was, where we are is where we belong. We are Polish Jews, and we're fighting against anti-Semitism in Poland. So the Zionist movement was very much a minority concern, and it had to fight against the more dominant strains inside the Jewish communities, which were socialist to one degree or another, either Labour type or Buntist, like the Polish organisation, or after the Russian Revolution of 1917, significant number of Jewish intellectuals and socialist activists moved in the direction of supporting the Russian Revolution. So that's the first point. The second is, how would it be possible to form this state? Because every previous colonial settler state, like the British in Australia, had been formed as an extension of an already existing state. In fact, the world's number one empire, the number one imperialist power. But there was no such force behind the Zionist movement. So it meant that from the beginning, the Zionist movement, to fulfill its aims, had to find a common ground, an alliance, with one or other of the big imperialist powers. And I'm cutting this short because they tried various of the big powers, from the United States to Tsarist Russia. But it was Britain which decided to sponsor the creation of an exclusivist Jewish state on the historic land of Palestine. Because Britain, towards the end of the First World War, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, is clearly going to lose. The Ottoman Empire had run this multinational empire, at one point stretching all the way from North Africa into the Balkans. And France and Britain carved up these lands, these territories, what are now Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, carved them up in a secret treaty in anticipation of being able to dominate the whole area. And one of the shifts in British policy was to support the Zionist movement's claim to a racially exclusive state in Palestine, a state formed by European settlement of Palestine. There were Jewish people in Palestine, about 20,000, of whom 10,000 were flatly opposed to the creation of a separate Jewish state. And the logic of the British position was summed up by a man who was the first Governor-General of Jerusalem, because Britain got not quite a colony, but got what was called the mandate to run Palestine after the First World War. A man called Sir Ronald Storrs, who proudly said that he was the first military governor of Jerusalem since the time of Pontius Pilate. So he's obviously not a modest man. But his words summed up the logic very well. He said, what we are supporting is a little loyal Jewish Ulster surrounded by a sea of potentially barbarous, potentially hostile Arabism. And he knew what he was talking about, because at this time, in 1921, Britain had been forced to retreat from holding Ireland completely as a colony, but had done so by creating this little loyalist Ulster of the 6 counties of the north of Ireland to divide and rule. And this was the policy of the British throughout the 20s and the 30s. But the Zionist movement is connected to a major imperialist power from the beginning. Something else, which was put by the leaders of the Bund in Poland, which is they said that if you create a state which excludes the Palestinians or doesn't allow them to belong fully in the economy, and that was the whole mechanism of the creation of the proto-Israeli state, there would be Jewish-only labour. No Palestinian would be employed in a Jewish firm or enterprise of whatever kind. If you do that, then you will create a hostile population without people who are driven off the land, and an internal hostile population of Palestinians who don't reconcile to being second-class citizens in this Israeli state. And they said that, isn't this a recipe, rather than for peace and reconciliation, and a safe future for Jewish people, isn't this a recipe for permanent antagonism, national chauvinism, and racism? And that was in 1938. It was absolutely prescient when you look at what happened afterwards. The British came up with a partition plan several times in the 1940s, but really in 1947. The United Nations, recently formed, agreed to partition Palestine. The Zionist colonization had grown in the course of the 1930s, and then at the end of the Second World War, for very, very obvious reasons, given the Holocaust, the scale of the destruction of the Jews of Europe. I should say that not most Jewish people, even then, would have preferred to go to the United States or Australia or Britain during the late 1930s as the shadow of Hitler is falling across Europe. But the major Western powers held a conference in Evian in France where, in 1938, where they decided to close the borders to Jewish emigration. The only emigration that would be allowed would be to Palestine. And even then, the British were kind of on and off with the migration to Palestine because they wanted to use it against the Arabs, but they didn't want to antagonize the Arabs too much that there'd be a general Arab revolt, as there had been in 1936. So you have the partition plan, which already is hugely beneficial to the Jewish minority of Palestine. But it's immediately, as independence is declared, in 1948, it leads to so-called War of Independence, which is the driving out of 750,000, 800,000 Palestinians from their homes. And large parts of the territory, which was supposed to belong to a Palestinian state, are taken by force by the advancing Israeli armies. You have a further war in 1967, which brings the West Bank and the Gaza Strip under full occupation of Israel. But when people talk of two states, I think it's quite important to remember there was a plan for two states in 47 and 48. What happened to the plan for two states? It came up against the expansionist dynamic of the Israeli state, an expansionist dynamic which at key points has been beneficial to, first of all, British colonialism and imperial control of the Middle East and French. Britain, France and Israel jointly invaded or tried to invade Egypt in 1956 to overthrow a radical nationalist president. And after 56, after 67 really, it's been critical to how the United States has pursued its interests inside the Middle East. So the two-state solution was there, but founded on these twin realities of an expansionist Israeli state and in alliance with the major Western imperial powers. And one consequence of that has been that over the course of the last 30 years, 40 years, you've seen a decline in the international standing of Israel compared with the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1967 war between Israel and its neighbours, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, to some extent, Lebanon. In that war, a large number of people on the left around the Western world were sympathetic to the Israeli state because the Holocaust was such a recent phenomenon. We saw only 20-odd years earlier. And that continued into the 1970s. And it wasn't just for that reason. It's also because the dominant political force in Israel, up until the late 1980s, was something called the Israeli Labour Party. Now, the extent to which it can claim to be socialist while excluding Arabs from the state is highly, highly questionable. But at least it had the trappings and the colour of a social democratic party. People could say that Israel is, with these kibbutz, the kibbutzim, is creating a new collective way of working, that it's a more egalitarian society. Again, so long as you ignore the Arabs. Said it's more egalitarian amongst the Jews. That was a dominant view all the way through until the early mid-1980s and still remained very, very influential. But precisely because Israel increasingly aligned, dependent upon, principally the United States, but to a far lesser extent, Britain, and this, as predicted, this push to seize more and more Palestinian land, the reality of the state of Israel has clashed with that, very much with that social democratic image. For really, I'd say it began in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which resulted in the expulsion of the Palestine Liberation Organization from Beirut, and also the massacres at the camps of Sabra and Shatila. That was the first time there was a rupture, a crack in the kind of broad social democratic support that Israel had enjoyed up to that point. And now it's really very, very clear. You don't have the Israeli Labour Party. You have the Likud, extremely right-wing party, led by its most right-wing leader ever, and then he is moderate compared with his coalition partners, extreme settler fanatics. And so you can't quite sell the idea that Israel is producing a social democratic society. Okay, we'll get round to do it. We'll have some peace, and we'll get round to extending the beneficence of Israel to the Arabs at some point. You can't sell that idea. I mean, look at the news today. You simply can't sell it. And in terms of the international support for Israel, it's not coming from social democratic politicians. They do in Europe. But the principal support for the Netanyahu government is Donald Trump. And so what did we have today to compound the barbarity on the border with Gaza? We had some Israelis wearing baseball caps saying, "Make Israel great again," straight from the Trump campaign. People should know what that means as well, that there is a strand on the hard right of Israeli politics for whom a greater Israel includes the east bank of the Jordan. It goes all the way over into Jordan, includes parts of Syria, not just the occupied part of the Golan Heights, and so on. And so it's in that context that we've seen in the last 13 years or so a major effort to rebrand Israel as being socially liberal, surrounded by this sea of barbarous Arabs. And it's not just an Israeli gambit. It comes from the politics in Western Europe and North America post-2001, 2003. You have the beginning of the war on terror and a succession of wars fought by the West, not all of them, but by the West as a whole, against Muslim-majority countries. And it necessitated an anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. It necessitated it even from those who were not stridently racist, weren't going out to disparage Arabs and Muslims. It necessitated it because either you have a good explanation why among 1.5 billion Muslims around the world there is an antagonism with the United States, Britain and France. It's not difficult to see the antagonism. Why might Algerian Muslims feel antagonistic towards France? Well, 1.5 million Algerians were killed in the war of liberation in the country in the 1950s into the 1960s. So either you acknowledge that there is a rational kernel for why it is that there's this hostility, or you say it's irrationalism. The reason they don't like our freedoms. And this didn't start in Israel. It started in France and the United States. It accelerated massively after 2001. But it provided the critical way for the successive Israeli governments to try to rebrand themselves. And when I say rebrand, I use the term, precisely, because in 2005, the Israeli government and the culture ministry and so on held a major conference called the Brand Israel Conference. Yeah, they set out with a marketing strategy to try to show that Israel is this oasis of liberal values. Okay, there may be problems with wars and what have you, but it's in questions of sexuality, questions of the rights of women. It's a liberal society. Incidentally, by accident, it ends up confirming that Israel indeed is a European society. It's a European colonial settler state. That's not what they intended, but it does end up doing that. So you have this Brand Israel Conference, $90 million, and it's multifaceted. It's Israeli culture, it's the beaches, and a part of it is that Israel is held up to be a haven for LGBTQs, gay people in the Middle East, that it is far, far better than anything around it, and therefore this is to the merit, to the credit of the Israeli state, and on that basis alone, or on that basis mainly, you should support it with its annexation of the Palestinians, or perhaps you can criticise that a little bit, but you certainly can't challenge the state fundamentally. Now, it's important to recall that although the term pinkwashing was developed for this attempt to put a pink gloss on the Israeli state, the Brand Israel process didn't start off with gay people, with lesbians and gay men. It started off with women in a highly misogynistic way. So the advert, one of the first adverts, was women of the Israeli Defense Forces. So you have sexy woman with gun, and this is the image of Israel. Our women are liberated. Look, they can fight against the Arabs too in mixed units. It's a bit like, I'm assuming it is, I don't think I've seen much of it. I'm assuming it's like the NRA's propaganda. You know, I've seen little memes and so on, you know, of some a conventionally attractive white woman with an AK-47 or something, and this is the model of progress. And so it's important to remember that, because it was very, very sexist the way that it was put. Second important thing is that the attitude of the Israeli government to gay rights in Israel, leave aside Palestine, in Israel, is extremely contradictory. So Benjamin Netanyahu rarely misses an opportunity on the international stage to mention that homosexuality is legal in Israel. It's actually legal in Palestine as well. The law was overturned in the 1950s. But in Israel itself, his base of support is the hard right and the ultra-Orthodox religious, both of whom are massively anti-gay. And so it's summed up by a journalist called Barak Ravid, writing in the Haaretz newspaper, liberal Israeli daily, where he says Netanyahu does this, but when he's confronted with the demand for the extension of LGBT rights in Israel, he runs from it as if he was on fire. And a professor of law called Ariel Gross put it very, very straightforwardly. He said that in Israel, LGBTQ rights have become a mere public relations device for the propagation of the Israeli state, which is run by people who are not at all sympathetic to LGBT rights. Nor is it true that the rights that, insofar as they exist, that gay people have got in Israel have come from above via some enlightened liberal government. It's exactly very similar to here or in Britain or in France or any of the other Western countries, that it was the explosion of the gay LGBT movement which force governments to decriminalise homosexuality, male homosexuality, forced advances of equality in tax and so on, and then later in civil partnerships and marriage and all the rest of it. So to hold up the limited LGBT rights in Israel as the benchmark of the state, and to ignore Netanyahu would be like saying, well, we'd be like saying that Trump is somehow a representative of gay liberation in the United States, because the movement for gay liberation has registered various successes which even he can't overturn in one simple go. And it would also be like saying, if you say that in Israel there's limited advances for gays, and therefore that outweighs, or it can be put on the balance with the dispossession of the Palestinians driven from their homes, the repression, the tearing up of the two-state solution, and so on. That would be a bit like saying, well, the fact that the Supreme Court granted equal marriage in the United States means we don't have to care that much about the number of black people killed every week by the police. It would be a pink patina on the reality of the state. And that's very much the case in Israel. I'm going to spell that out a bit now. First of all, it's important to recognise that the rights are highly limited. So, for example, the Israeli Supreme Court last year did not grant same-sex marriage. And as a consequence, there's only the most limited state recognition of same-sex relations. The reason for that is that the Jewish church, the rabbis, have a monopoly upon officiating at marriages. So you don't have political or civil marriage, where you can go to, you go to the town hall or something like that. Right. The mayor can marry you and so on. You can't have that in Israel. It's part of the compact of it being a Jewish state with a role for the organised Jewish faith. So you don't have that. And the images that you see of nightclubs, beaches in Tel Aviv, which are predominantly male images, by the way. This is quite important to recognise. If you think about lesbian liberation in Israel and encouraging it as a lesbian destination for tourism, it's far, far less. We're talking very much prioritising, privileging gay men in this enterprise. But you're talking about places which are very much the minority of the country. You can have a gay beach and a gay bar. That is not reflective of the overall society. Now, there are liberal Israelis. There are people who've supported the fight for LGBT rights. There's, I think, 65 or 70% of people in Israel say that they're in favour of equal marriage. But one consequence of these succession of wars and leading now to the alliance with Donald Trump and the sights turned on Iran has been to increase the hard right base of Israeli society. It's also increased through demographic means, which is that the ultra-Orthodox families generally have something like 8 or 10 children, whereas the more secular Jewish families have 2 or 3 children. So there is a real dysfunctionality of Israeli society. It has a westward-oriented face, trying to present these niches of, you can go to a gay bar or go to a nightclub or what have you. That oriented to the West, at the same time, within Israeli society itself, those things are massively contested and increasingly contested. So you see all sorts of attacks on pride demonstrations, either physical or political attacks, by the ultra-Orthodox. And there's a mechanism which generates that, which is the settlements. Because the more these settlements are built, surrounded by Palestinians, the more they're fortified, the more it necessitates an extreme racism and a reactionary set of ideas in general. So you find the settlers extremely racist about the Palestinians, also highly reactionary on the rights of women, the rights of LGBT people, and so on. There's another myth to this, which is that it's only in Israel and not in Palestine that there's been any agitation by activists for gay liberation, for LGBTQ liberation. That's not true. I mean, there's an organisation, Palestinian Queers for BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. There's Aswat, Al-Qaws, 3 Palestinian gay, queer organisations. And they have battled against the twin problems which are related. The Israeli occupation, or in the case of the siege on Gaza, the siege, itself, of course, is massively damaging to the Palestinians. But the other thing that it does is it disrupts the development, the free development of Palestinian society. It strengthens reactionary forces, reactionary currents inside those societies. And it's not just Israel that's done this. If you go back to the colonial period, the Mandate period in the Middle East, or the colonies in Africa, where do you find countries such as Uganda or in Lebanon, which is repealed it, where did these anti-gay laws come from in the colonies? They came from the colonial powers. I mean, the French were extremely distressed when they rolled up into Lebanon to find 2 things. Large numbers of women working in Beirut in the tobacco industry, which had a social consequence, which is that the woman was the main breadwinner in several households, which changed the whole relations between the sexes, not across the country as a whole, but inside that part of the Lebanese working class. That was the one thing they didn't like. The other thing they didn't like was the hammam, the bathhouse. It's not quite the same as the bathhouse here, but the Turkish bath, where men would be together intimately and so on. This was shocking to the European imagination. So they closed the bathhouses, and they also they imported a women's magazine, French women's magazine, which developed in the 1920s, the era of consumerism and so on. This is when all these women's magazines really take off. They import this wholesale, desperate for Lebanese women to read about how to be a good housewife and not going out to the factory. So the complete myth is that there has always been a progressive West on these questions and a reactionary East. Now, of course, there's been reaction in the East. Of course, that's true. But if you look back to before the colonial period, you find a much more complex relationship between a set of understandings of homosexuality inside the Middle East. You also find that in Africa. I've not got time to go through it, but one of the great crimes that this whole argument commits is this cultural essentialism that Muslims and the Arabs and Africans are inherently reactionary on these questions. In fact, you find French and British literature both shock and fascination among white European civil servants and colonial administrators at the very different and complex understandings of sexuality in India, in Egypt, and in other countries. It's if people haven't read it, I strongly recommend you do. It's a major theme of Edward Said's book on Orientalism, dismantling these ideas. Just a few final points. I think it gets even more reactionary than that, because you end up with a view. There's a claim that Palestinians can come to Tel Aviv and be out as gay, and therefore it provides a refuge for them. Now, very few Palestinians can or do that, but that whole claim is associated with a real racialization of the politics of sexuality and sex. It's there in the imagery, the promoting Israel as a gay destination. It's certainly there in the erotica and pornography, which is that the Arab man is simultaneously oversexed, but also more repressed than the Jewish man. And that plays out in all sorts of ways. I'm talking about men because really the women really don't get a look in over this. There's not much pressed over the question of lesbian liberation. Now, just to kind of wrap that up a little bit, the fundamental point, I think, has to be this, that as in South Africa, where there was a white-led gay movement, it is impossible to talk about gay liberation, LGBT liberation, when there is such a glaring racial divide and more than half the population are oppressed on that basis. And it is now more than half the population. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are now, according to the Israeli army's estimate, and they estimate these things very, very accurately, there are now 6.4 million Jewish people and 6.8 million Palestinian people living as second-class citizens or under occupation or under siege. And so the idea that in the equivalent of white South Africa, that you could fight for gay liberation or even equal rights without taking up the fundamental disfigurement of the society, which is the racial division, I think is absolutely hopeless. And there are some Israeli LGBT activists who do recognise that. They are more pro-Palestinian. They're at least for some equality. They're at least for what they would see as a viable two-state solution and so on. But that's not the position of the Israeli Tourism Board, the LGBT Film Festival that happens in Israel, which gets its money from the Culture Ministry, and part of the funding from the Culture Ministry is that the film festival will not criticise the state of Israel. So imagine, we're fighting the big battle for sexual freedom and sexual liberation on the dime of the Netanyahu's Culture Ministry, who insists that we can't say something about the fundamental question, which affects the whole country. That's the first point. The second point is that there is hope for an advance for lesbian and gay rights in the Middle East, but it will have to come as a part of the struggle against the historic disfigurements of the Middle East. The subordination to Western interests, one consequence of that, the promotion of one dictatorship or authoritarian regime after another. This is part and parcel of the question of divine rule. And so it's the processes of struggle on the social question, on the question of peace, not war, that can create an environment in which the LGBT question can be raised as well. The very final thing I want to say is that the idea that the pinkwashing idea really comes crashing down when you consider that in the shift that's taking place in Middle Eastern politics now, and has done over the last year, the closest Arab ally of Israel is Saudi Arabia. Now, a 16-year-old woman from the United Arab Emirates has just been lashed some unbearable amount of times because she was gang raped in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it is absolutely barbaric. Yet Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, are absolutely committed to an alliance directed against Iran and an alliance with Trump. And I think that one example shows you how this whole claim about Israel and LGBT rights has not been about even celebrating those rights that have been won. It's been about instrumentalizing the question, which shouldn't be instrumentalized, it's a question in its own right, for purposes of the sustaining of the Israeli state, its interests in the United States.
Thank you, Kevin. We'll give Kevin a break. I'd like to ask Paula to come up to make an announcement for the Broadway Methodist Church about some of the programs that they're doing in solidarity with Palestinians, and then Roger Frazier from the Gay Liberation Network. And just before come on up here, Paula, I'll get you a mic. Before I turn the microphone over to them, 2 quick points. One, there's going to be an emergency demonstration tomorrow at 500 South Michigan Avenue, beginning at 4 p.m., called in reaction to the horrible events today, the really dramatic escalation of barbarity on the part of the Israeli state against Palestinians. So I encourage everyone to do like me and try and skip out of work, etc. The other thing, which Kevin covered a lot, but there is much more that could be covered, and one of the central things I think we should be talking about is also that we are probably closer to war against Iran or some horrible bombing of some sort than we have been for at least a few decades. And a lot of that has very much to do with Israel constantly pushing for a tougher stance against Iran. Both Israel and, of course, the United States supporting the barbaric bombing of Yemen right now, which has killed many, many thousands and led to the biggest cholera epidemic in recorded history. And so we're facing a very dangerous situation here, and yet Israel is a nuclear power, thanks in part to the United States, and is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but apparently this is all good by Donald Trump as well as, I might add, the Democrats. So these are some things that maybe we could develop more in the discussion, because certainly the dividing lines, which side are you on, are being drawn right now between Trump and his racist allies and the rest of us. So here, we'll give it over to Paula, and then we'll have it's at 500 South Michigan Avenue, 4 p.m. It's called by the
Coalition for
Justice in
Palestine.
Yes, yes. So anyway, Paula, please make your announcement.
I think that's, Kevin, first of all, thank you. That was a fascinating tour of history. So this little part that I have is, many of you know I'm Methodist. I'm a member of the church here. I'm a member of United Methodist for Kairos Response. And somewhere in that history that Kevin was talking about, there was the call for BDS. And that was in 2005. And Omar Barghouti gathered, I guess it was 170 Palestinian civil society organizations. And they made this call throughout the world for BDS, to boycott Israel until Israel, one, guaranteed the right of return, equal rights for Palestinian Israelis living inside Israel, and take down the separation wall. So then after that, a few years after that, Palestinian Christians got together, and they said, no one seemed to be really listening to or seeing what was going on with the Christian community in the Holy Land, and how they are Palestinian first. So everything that was happening, people tended to think of it as just happening to Muslims, but it was happening to the Christians. And so they issued that cry, and it was modeled after that letter from the Kairos letter from South Africa saying, Christians of the world, you have to pay attention. You have to speak out. And so that was the Kairos letter. It's on our website, United Methodist for Kairos Response. And since then, the Methodist Church has taken on, sometimes with some success, sometimes not so much success, trying to get the church to support the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. What we have is a resolution for boycott, of companies that profit from the occupation, which someone pointed out, since Israel is blurring the lines between where Israel is and where Palestine is, it makes sense to sort of blur the lines between we're boycotting companies here and boycotting companies there, because that has been one of the pushbacks against the call for boycott is it's going to harm Israel and companies that are, legitimately doing business in Israel and maybe not being influenced or influential in the occupation. So if you want more information, you can go to our website, www.kairosresponse.org, or pick up some literature, because the other thing that the Northern Illinois Conference did, yay for us, is we were the first conference to pass a resolution talking about advocating for the rights of Palestinian children in military detention. So that was last year in our annual conference, and then since then, Betty McCollum came up with the bill, HR 4391. So there's a further call asking for Methodists to call on their representatives to say, hey, you need to get behind this bill Betty McCollum has issued for advocating for the rights of Palestinian children. I think that's...
Thank you, Paula. Here, come on up.
Thank you. You know, there's two ways in which dissent with respect to what's happening in Israel happens in this country. The first is just silence. The commercial media does not cover events. But there's a second way in which dissent is silenced, and that is that issues are framed in a particularly biased way. Consider that the way that the reaction by Palestinians and the murders and so on is going to be framed on not just on Fox News but on MSNBC and CNN tonight will be in terms of the opposition to the movement of an embassy from one city to Jerusalem. Will there be any context? Will there be any historical context, the kind we got here tonight? Not at all. It is up to us then to provide the dissent that will overcome the silence and begin the process of informing people, because people are not in this country immoral or unappreciative of suffering elsewhere. They just don't see it framed, and they don't hear it talked about. So it doesn't gain the legitimacy. It's up to us to do that. I'm calling, or we're calling, GLN, Gay Liberation Network, is going to be involved on June 24th, which is the last Sunday in June, with a contingent in the Pride Parade this year. And my truck, I'm proud to say, which I've donated every year, is going to carry a sign which I think will say, LGBTQ stand with Palestine. And as a subheading, it's going to say, Israel, stop killing Palestinians. And we're going to have an audience out there of 1 million people lining the streets to see that. Many of them have experience with oppression right here at home. People of color, lots of them. We're going to make that link between what happens in Israel and here. We're going to start a conversation, and get the spotlight, the moral spotlight of attention focused clearly on the oppression that's happening in Israel, so that people can begin to do the investigation and so on, that is not being done on CNN or on MSNBC, let alone on Fox News, or in the Boston Globe or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and all the other newspapers of record. We've got to do it ourselves, And I'm asking all of you to be there with our contingent. Let me tell you where it's at. I'll read this. 11 a.m. sharp, Sunday, June 24th, in front of the Target store in Uptown. It's just up the street, you know, from here. 4466 Broadway, 1 block south of the Wilson Red Line stop. And look for the pride flag. I'll be carrying it, I promise you. You know, I'll be carrying the pride flag. Look for me. Look for my ugly face. And it'll be on a tall stick. And we'll meet there at Target, in front of Target, and we'll walk down to this contingent. Let me tell you something. It'll be a huge banner. It'll stand, Andy, how tall?
About 14 foot. It's 400 square feet, I believe.
It's going to be huge. Let me read it again. LGBTQ stand with Palestine. Israel, stop killing Palestinians. And we'll have chants. We'll have, but if you swell the crowd, it gives us even more legitimacy. That's why it's so important, not just to have my truck, you know, and a few of us, but the larger our contingent, the more legitimacy. Because we'll get a lot of catcalls. We'll get people that oppose us. You know, we'll have flyers like this to pass out. The more people we have, the more legitimacy. So I beg all of you, don't just bring yourselves, bring your families, your friends. Join us to stand with the Palestinians. Thank you.
You've given me an inspiration. I live in Evanston. Every year they have a 4th of July parade. Years ago, Dale, Mary Lou, and I, who were part of Neighbors for Peace in Evanston.
It's for recording. Go ahead.
Every year in Evanston, they hold a big 4th of July parade. I can't stand it. But before I was around Neighbors for Peace, Dale and others, many people in Neighbors for Peace in Evanston, which were really just a small group, marched in the 4th of July parade, and I understand they were the most popular. They got all, well, this was like in 2003 and 2004, okay? We got to do that again. Neighbors for Peace is for Palestine. I don't know if we can say Evanston is for Palestine, but maybe we should. And yeah, thanks for the inspiration.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
For Palestine and Mexico, the wall must fall, right?
Absolutely. So we do have some time for discussion. I'd encourage people to raise disagreements, raise questions, make a point. And after a few comments, I'll allow, he'll steal the mic from me. No, I won't allow him. He'll just steal the mic from me. And Kevin will come back with some comments. So we've got some time. Don't be bashful. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a further announcement. I got a communication today from Jewish Voice for Peace, of which I am a member, and they are urging people in Illinois, it would be to contact Durbin. I believe he's the senator from Jerusalem. But people are being urged to contact these people, in our case Durbin and Tammy Duckworth, to urge them to speak out. Their silence has been deafening. 4 senators have spoken out against the Israeli massacre occurring at the Gaza frontier, and 17 members of the House of Representatives. Now, Schakowsky is one of them. Danny Davis is another from Illinois. The senators were Sanders. Let's see if I can remember this now.
The 2 women from New Hampshire.
Yeah, Leahy was another one. Who? Yeah, I mentioned Sanders. Well, anyway, 4 senators have spoken out, so there are plenty of senators. You know, the Democrats, as Andy mentioned, and I think it's important to underscore this. I mean, the support for the Israeli regime has become more explicit under Trump, but it certainly didn't begin with Trump. I mean, it's been U.S. policy for years to put up this facade of being a neutral broker for negotiations, but it's just that, it's a facade. Now the facade has been dropped. So at least there's a kind of honesty and transparency there. We can forget about all the BS that's been going on for decades. But anyway, please call Duckworth and Durbin and urge them to speak out against Israeli terror.
Thank you, Bob. Keep on passing this around, Brent.
Kevin, I appreciated your comments. I have particularly struggled with how to have conversations with folks that, as we all battle with, terrorism and this, this fear that, what could they possibly not like about our society and our people? And so your words, particularly the word, a rational reason that the Muslim world is an antagonist of Western ways, I found really helpful. Particularly, with the Pulse shooting and things, just many times I struggled with how do I have this conversation that can be heard by someone who does not want to villainize the United States as I might want to, but that really has a deep, a deep care, a deep pride in the United States and the West, and how do you start that conversation of this? So anyway, I appreciate the word rational.
Well, one might say, why is it the United States so totally opposed the Arab Spring from one country to the next in terms of supporting all the existing dictators, Hosni Mubarak et al.? I think your point, Kevin, about that we should be inclined to excuse, for example, American racism against black people because LGBTs, say, have the right to marry and so forth is a very apt analogy. And you look at the racism, and I'd like to, if you could, go into some of the statistics. There was a Pew poll, I believe it was, that found that 48% of Israeli Jews favored so-called transfer. Now let me break that down, what that means. If 48% of white Chicagoans favored the expulsion of black or brown people from this city, I think we could honestly say that's a very racist society. That's what the polls say amongst Israeli Jews. 48%, this is a couple years ago, this poll, said they favored the expulsion of Palestinians from Israel. I think it speaks volumes about the depths of racism, and there are plenty of statistics in terms of the detentions without trial, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you could go into some of that a little bit and break it down for us, Kevin.
Sure.
I'll get this close to you here. Go ahead.
Shall I respond to all of these as a group? Are we having another round as well? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. On Paula's point, you're absolutely right. The 2005 is both the year of the BDS and the counterattack. And it's not just pinkwashing. The Israeli government has recognized what it refers to as an existential threat to it by the BDS movement. And one of the reasons for that is because the movement to boycott, divest, and divest from and sanction Israel, speaks to universal values, yet pitches itself around the right to return, the right to equality, about righting the historic injustice, all of which is recognised in international law. And that has traction increasingly around the world, notwithstanding Ivanka Trump, putting a plaque, or going to put the plaque on the embassy wall in Jerusalem. So, for example, in the United States, an increasing number of young Jewish people say that they refer to Israel as them rather than us, and also say that Israel should be held to the same universal standards of account as any other state, which is a major shift. And so the official Jewish organizations, pro-Likud, pro-Netanyahu organizations, are increasingly out on a limb compared with, it's not necessarily a socialist view, but compared with a deeply human view, which is growing around the world. And so, yeah, the big pushback, pinkwashing, the attempts to break the cultural boycott in particular, began in 2005. I have to say that they're losing ground. When we were talking at the beginning, Paul, and the Methodist Church in Britain has adopted a full BDS position, and so have some other churches. A couple of days ago, the government had responded to attempts by local councils to raise boycotting Israel by declaring that illegal. Well, a High Court judge in London quashed that and said it is legal to boycott Israel. And that will probably open up a number of avenues to try and pursue that. The government's going to appeal, but I'm not at all confident that they will be able to win it. In British public opinion, 66% of people now have a negative or very negative view of the state of Israel, which is historically enormously high. So I think that's the kind of battleground, and it is a propaganda war, except that the BDS is also a material war, because it really does make a difference if acts pull out from Israel, if there's the academic boycott, if companies feel that they will lose business in the much bigger markets of the United States and the European Union if they don't at least pull out of the occupied settlements, and we want it to go much further than that. But that's the position of the British trade union movement, the TUC, is for a boycott of companies which do business and make money out of the illegal settlements. On the point about it being not just Trump, that's absolutely true. I mean, it began before 1967, but really 1967 is a major turning point. The United States, by far the dominant global power, and Israel demonstrating in the Six-Day War that it had the capacity to be very useful militarily as well as useful politically inside the Middle East. Now, that said, I think there is if not a shift, then a development which is taking place at the moment, because there's always been tensions between the United States and Israel. You know, people talk of the Israel lobby as if the Israel lobby determines US policy against the interests of the United States. In fact, it's the other way around. The United States policy has been formed, and an extension of that is to support Israel because it's been seen to be in the interests of the United States. But that doesn't mean that the particular interests of an Israeli government and of the US state always coincide. I mean, I'll give you one example which, is quite surprising, really, which is in 2001, George Bush announced that there would be a roadmap to peace in the Middle East, a roadmap to Palestinian nationhood, statehood. This is immediately after 9/11. And he did it for a very simple reason, to try to build the widest coalition at that point for the war on Afghanistan. We're less kind of fussy about having a wide coalition when it came to the war on Iraq, but this was very important for them, draw in Arab leaders. Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, said, we're not having a roadmap to peace, we're not having a roadmap to Palestinian statehood, and launched a massive incursion into the West Bank. Now, it's not true that Israel and the US came to blows fully. I describe it as kind of at points, and at points it's been in recent years, an unhappy marriage with neither partner prepared to sue for divorce. I mean, the Israelis can't sue for divorce. Israel is completely dependent, massively dependent upon the United States. And this came to a head under Obama. It wasn't because Obama was terribly liberal. It was because Netanyahu was and is terribly obnoxious and refused to grant anything in terms of scaling back the settlement building program, making any gesture at all. And this famously underlay the froideur, the tension between Obama and Netanyahu. And it was summed up by John Kerry, Obama's Secretary of State, in December of 2016, his final public speech in that office, where he excoriated Netanyahu in terms of an American politician, not in our terms, but in terms of a mainstream American politician. And he made an observation. He said that either Israel can be a Jewish state or it can be a democratic state, but it can't be both if you abandon the two-state solution, because more and more Arabs will be drawn into the borders of Israel, and they will, in order to control them, it will mean keeping them as second-class citizens, so you won't have a democratic state. Now, that's quite an extraordinary thing for someone like John Kerry to say, and he said it in justification for why the US had very rarely, had on one of the rare occasions, used its veto to, not used its veto to veto a UN Security Council resolution condemning the settlement building program. Netanyahu said this is tantamount to the Holocaust, the fact that the United States has allowed this to go through. But that showed some of the tensions. Now, there's different ways of resolving those tensions. Trump's is one. Trump's way of resolving the tensions is to move very, very close to Likud and to Netanyahu, to adopt their positions as American positions in the policy-making process in the United States. So while the Israel lobby doesn't determine policy, Trump has prioritized the relationship with Israel, and that is now feeding back inside all sorts of frictions inside the administration of the United States, inside the state itself, because it's still arguable that what the United States could really do with is at least the fig leaf of a peace process, which it could then use to keep King Hussein of Jordan on board, which General Sisi could use to say that something is being done to for our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and so on. To rip that out and go for this course of confrontation, a war drive, whether it leads to war or not, we don't know, but a war drive with Iran. You do that and you remove the fig leaf of some kind of United States interest in achieving justice for the Palestinians. We know it was a fig leaf. But if you remove that, things become very, very unstable indeed. So I think there is a development with Trump. That's not to say, you have to be careful. In focusing on Trump, we don't want to whitewash all that's gone before. Trump's policy is a development of American policy, and the Obama policy had failed. Trump's is a development, a right-wing turn, very aggressive and pro-Netanyahu, but it emerges from the failure of the Obama policy. On the question of the Pulse shooting and how we make these arguments, I think one argument to make is that the more that people in the West say that sympathy for gay rights or homosexuality itself as being regarded as in some way normal or acceptable, the more people in the West say that that is uniquely Western, the more it strengthens all the reactionary forces in Asia and in Africa, who also want to say it's uniquely Western. I mean, often these people are clinging to legal codes which date from the British and French colonial period in Africa. That was the case in Uganda, for example. And one thing which helps them is if Western activists are saying Yes, it is. It's a Western thing, this homosexuality. Well, that means the Ugandan government says, well, yeah, that's right, so we don't want it. We kicked out the colonisers, we kicked out the imperialists, and we're not having advanced for homosexual rights. So that's one argument to make, I think, Brent, against the tendency to see just a massive reaction in the Muslim world. If you want to unite people behind reaction, then say that a fundamental aspect of humanity is actually uniquely Western and has always been condemned in the Middle East. That's one way to do that. I'll leave that there, I think.
Okay, let's pass the microphone around here. Go ahead.
Netanyahu reminds me of Henry Kissinger in that he won't go away. I'm totally ignorant about the political party happenings in Israel.
About what, sorry?
The political party events in Israel. Are we stuck with, like in this country, just a reaction, kind of a semi-permanent or permanent reactionary party attitude toward the Palestinians? What I'm asking is, what's the nature of the attitude toward the Palestinian-Israeli situation amongst other Israeli political parties?
Yeah, I have two questions, Kevin. The first has to do with your analysis of the of Zionism. Isn't there, using your kind of terminology from last Saturday, there's a center-left Israeli position that I've read authors in the New York Review of Books enunciate. And that is that Herzl and some of the early Zionists were in fact not interested in a nation-state formation, but rather in the establishment of a Jewish homeland for protection, and the argument is that betrayal by the British. After the First World War, and then again, during and after the Second World War, plus the intransigence of the Arabs in Palestine, led to a hardening of the Zionist position and the change to this idea of forming a nation state. I'd like you to comment on that, because your analysis seemed to challenge that. You started with it was a nation state from start to finish. The second point builds on what Rich asked, and that is what led to the decline of the Labor Party and the growth of the Likud? Why does Israel seem now just totally filled with racists, and the peace effort and the progressive forces seem in absolute retreat? What happened to lead to that?
Okay, other questions or comments?
I don't know if this is true, but when you talk, do people accuse you of being anti-Semitic? And how do you respond to those kinds of challenges?
Okay, got one more over here.
Yeah, some of the recent historians' research into the origins of the founding of Israel document quite solidly that it was always intent on an exclusionary state. Some of the comments that are documented in the British archives that form the basis of State of Terror by a historian named Suarez, are letters from European Jews who visited the Holy Land and commented at how racist the Zionist settlers were towards the Palestinians. Also looking at the Labor Party, or whatever its early formations were called, they always had, regardless of their pretense at socialism, an exclusionary policy to deny Palestinians the opportunity to continue working on land that they purchased, to work in the businesses that they purchased, and it was the intransigence not of the Palestinians, but of the Zionists, who from fairly early on made clear that they were there to stay, that they were exclusionary, and that they intended on expanding and forcing the Palestinians off of their land. So my reading confirms many of the things that you've said, and I wonder if you could comment on the book State of Terror, how terrorism founded modern Israel, if you're familiar with it.
Okay, one last chance. I would just like, I think it is important to point out that the pro-Israel position for the last several decades has been a bipartisan policy here in the United States, and the stance of senators such as Schumer and so forth, and of course our own Democratic Party senators here in Illinois, is not accidental. That Israel has been a linchpin to U.S. control of the Middle East, and both parties don't want to let go of that. And of course, President Obama had the single largest arms aid package heretofore. That said, and also I should mention that the LGBT community, the various NGOs with their six-figure salaries and huge staffs and offices and so forth, I'm talking particularly about the National LGBT Task Force, because they are so tied with the Democratic Party, they follow that policy in lockstep in terms of promoting pinkwashing, such as we saw at the National LGBT Task Force Creating Change conference here in Chicago in January 2016. But that said, I think we really miss a beat if we don't point out that a president who's universally reviled for being the most awful racist that we have seen perhaps in modern times, you know, I'm thinking Democratic President Wilson being the other one, but that's sort of ancient history. He is so reviled as a racist and a bigot on any number of other different scores that we miss a beat if we don't point out that it's no accident that he has grasped this embrace of Israel even firmer than we've seen under previous presidents. And it says something about the state of Israel being a racist state. And we miss a beat if we don't point that out. So I'm going to let Kevin come back, and take your time, Kevin, and we'll enjoy what you have to say.
Just on Roger's point, yeah, I have heard that argument, but it isn't true. The plan was to colonize Palestine, which meant denying very, very often that there were Palestinians living in Palestine, and emptied a land without a people for a people without a land. But the mechanism, what do you do when you land in Haifa and you set up your family, your colons, literally a colony, you know, like the British at Jamestown, you know, excluding the people living here, right, and having a closed economy. And if you do that, and it was central to what was called the Eruv, the Jewish, exclusively Jewish society come state that they were trying to build. So Palestinian labour is excluded, so no Jewish enterprise would employ a Palestinian. So in order to do that, you have to enforce the strictest of racial separations. The Jewish product was defended. So Jewish people boycotted the Arabs. They bought only from Jewish suppliers. So you create a parallel society. It's a minority society. It's not an oppressed society. It's a colonizing society, which gradually pushes out large numbers of Arabs. And the idea of state building was there right at the very beginning of the political Zionist movement, because they actually adopted the general thinking of European nationalists with a particular twist, quite a reactionary twist. A lot of the Zionist leaders said that the Jewish people of Europe could not be complete, that they would be effete, that they would not be able to be a proper nation unless they were constituted into a nation state. And quite really reactionary ideas, so that Jews needed to get on the land and work hard as agricultural labourers, and this would toughen up the Jewish race, which would otherwise be intellectual and cosmopolitan in Vienna and Berlin and so on. These were arguments that Herzl made. A kind of ethnic nationalism, albeit as a response to anti-Semitism, with the construction of a nation state, fully fledged nation state. Now, what did radicalise in the 1930s was, because there was opposition from the Arabs, which kind of ebbed and flowed, and the British tried to balance in between, but usually coming down on the side of the Zionist movement, it opened the door to a more radically right-wing formation than the Israeli Labour Party. Jabotinsky, the so-called Iron Wall, the forerunner of Likud. See, for a lot of the Israeli Labour Party leaders were terribly racist, but for a lot of the average people supporting the Israeli Labour Party, it was, look, we need to separate, form our own state, and then we'll have peace with the Arabs. And our advances with these kibbutzim, the economic advances, the fact that we have a democracy, albeit essentially a Jewish democracy, this will be a light amongst the nations. This will be a light amongst the Arabs. This is what a lot of people believed who fought in the, as you mentioned, the literally the terror gangs, because I'm not using that moralistically. It's a good description of what the Stern Gang and the others did in the 1940s. That people who fought that, okay, there'll be bloodshed and so on, but then we will establish the state, and it will lead to democratization elsewhere in the Middle East. There's a book by a man called Maxim Hilan, who was one of those fighters. He wrote it in 1972, and the title is How Israel Lost Its Soul. So already by 1972, this dream of this Labour Zionist, Socialist Zionist dream was beginning to falter. And that brings me to the second question, which is this radicalisation to the right of Israeli politics. Well, to be honest, if you fight one war after another against the Palestinians, you generate a radical right. I mean, how do you justify the oppression of the people of Gaza? You have to have an increasingly racist and chauvinist line. It's also the case that the internal decomposition of Israeli politics means that the far-right forces based upon the settlements have a great leverage, as do the ultra-Orthodox, as I mentioned in the introduction. So in terms of, in response to your question, you have a range of Israeli parties. The Likud actually lost ground at the last election, but it was forced into a coalition with even more right-wing forces. The Israeli Labour Party is kind of repositioning it's much weaker than it used to be. It's repositioning itself with various centrist figures. But there is a dysfunctionality of Israeli society. Because if you're in a state of permanent war, then authoritarian, racist, sexist, anti-gay ideas become generated at home. Look at the United States. You know, if you, the more that you have these wars projected abroad, the more it generates all those kinds of reactionary forces. And that's really what's happened in Israel. After the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, signed up to Oslo, you've then seen a long retreat, sometimes quite rapid, from the Oslo Accords by the Israeli government. I suppose the difference with Trump now is that Trump is embracing the Netanyahu position, which is that there will not be a Palestinian state. I mean, it used to be a couple of years ago that for those of us who believed in one single state in which Jews and Arabs would live together, it used to be put to us that that we denied the two-state solution, that was the realistic solution. Now, with the facts on the ground and the abandonment by Trump and Netanyahu of the peace process, actually the two-state solution, insofar as it ever was one, stands as a rebuke to them. They're creating one state, in reality. The question is, what kind of state will it be? Will it be a democratic state, or will it have entrenched apartheid and 48% of people in Israel, Jews in Israel, in favour of the transfer of the Palestinians, which means uprooting people from the West Bank and from Israel itself over into Jordan. So the slogan of the Israeli right is, there is a Palestinian state, it's on the east bank of the Jordan River. Now, the only way that you can do that you can move millions of people, is in conditions of near total war and of massive ethnic cleansing, like in 47, 48, but on an even bigger scale. So that's the prospect that's being held out by these people as they pinkwash and say, you know, you can go and have a great gay weekend in Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, it's not just the Palestinians who are suffering, it's Israeli society is locked into this course with more and more to the right. I say society, it's more the politics. In the society, there are people trying to pull in the opposite direction. And everything we do here to counter the propaganda, counter the pinkwashing and so on, is an additional strength to them. Voila.
Okay, well, let's give Kevin another hand here. Thank you, Kevin. I should note that Kevin appeared on the Gay Liberation Network's television program speaking about events in Palestine. That will be available on YouTube. And thank you very much to our folks from CAN TV. Tonight's program will be rebroadcast a few times, I understand. So thank you very much, CAN TV, Chicago Access Network. Thank you all to the Broadway United Methodist Church. Thank you very much for hosting us here tonight and for your very courageous stance in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So remember, tomorrow, 4 p.m. at 500 South Michigan Avenue, please do what you can to be out there. There literally was a horrible massacre today, and we need to stand up against it. And also remember Roger's announcement about the Pride Parade contingent. This will be a unique opportunity for us to break through the media blackout of all things Palestine, being able to literally greet 1 million people in the streets of Chicago with a pro-Palestinian message. The more people we have there, the more effective that message will be. So thank you again, Kevin, and thank you all for coming out on this really horrible night. Take care.